Disclaimer: this video is going to be a rather thorough analysis of the themes as I understood them in the 2008 anime Michiko and Hatchin. As such, it will contain spoilers for the entire series, and I do recommend that you watch the show first to get a good grasp of the context, but also just because it's a really good show that I feel isn't talked about enough. For those that watch this video in spite of that, I hope you enjoy it anyways. Love is complicated. It's more than just a feeling you have. It's an organic, evolving, and changing thing that takes on many forms. The love you feel for your parents is probably different than the love you have for your romantic partner or the love that you have for your pets. Love is more than just attraction. It's happiness, sadness, anger, and so many other things. I feel it isn't right to classify it as its own emotion when the loving relationship you have with someone or even something can be a complicated mess of emotions. But love is being able to work through all of that and make something great. This thorough understanding of love, in my opinion, is the core of what makes Michiko and Hatchin truly incredible. Sayo Yamamoto is perhaps more known for her directorial work on something like Yuri on Ice, or maybe even The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, but Michiko and Hatchin would be her directorial debut on anime. And to say it took some chances would be an understatement, I feel. Set in a fictional country that is analogous to Brazil, it stars a predominantly black and Hispanic cast of characters, along with not an insignificant amount of very clearly queer representation. It's such an interesting show, perhaps being one of the only anime I've ever seen that could be qualified under the road trip genre, and it's really stood out from the other shows I've watched recently. In summary, Michiko Malandro is a convict who starts the series escaping from prison to look for a man named Hiroshi Morenos, and Michiko decides to use Hana Morenos, Hiroshi's daughter and layer called Hatchin, to help find him. Michiko seems to have known Hiroshi and had a thing for him, believing that she'll live happily ever after with him when the two finally meet. Hatchin doesn't trust Michiko at first, initially just going with her to escape an abusive family, but she does eventually care for Michiko and vice versa. This all pans out in a cross-country trip where they meet all sorts of people with their own struggles and lives that seem to closely echo their own. Eventually, they do find Hiroshi, and Hatchin goes to live with him, but not before Michiko surrenders to the police and goes back to jail. Many years later, Michiko and Hatchin meet up again, presumably going to set out on yet another trip across the country. Obviously, I left out a significant amount of details, like Michiko being part of a gang with Hiroshi and another man named Satoshi Batista, but I again recommend watching the anime itself if you'd like a better context on what I'm about to dive into. According to an interview with her, Sayo Yamamoto took a trip to Brazil in preparation for making this anime. She took a tour there but ended up going her own way to check out the more rough parts of the country. And while it's certainly not thorough, I do appreciate that she took from things that she actually experienced and saw while she was there, even despite not being a complete picture of the country. But she has a clear love of the country that shines through in each and every episode, possibly within each passing minute. Despite a rather short, at the time, run of 22 episodes, there are so many points where the show stops to take a breather, letting the audience really get a good idea of the world that we're in. It makes it feel all the more alive, more than just a setting for the events to take place in. These breathers, as I call them, are just the surface level of Michiko and Hatchin's love, providing us as the audience not only a moment to appreciate the wonderfully realized world, but also the characters and the struggles that they go through. Each passing moment of Michiko and Hatchin is uniquely beautiful in a way that I don't believe can be articulated with words, and I love when art can give me that feeling. The costume and character design is also immaculate, reflecting the styles and a bit of the culture that the show is taking inspiration from. I also really love that the characters have unique outfits for pretty much every new episode, even if it doesn't make much sense from a financial standpoint of our two main protagonists. I also feel this show does quite a good job in representation of marginalized groups, being one of the very few anime to star a black woman lead. Being a white person myself, I don't believe I'm qualified to say much more on this matter, and I do urge you to check out this playlist of reviews I've compiled from largely black creators that talk more in depth about this. But Michiko and other black characters within the story are never reduced as stereotypes. The opposite is largely the case, with pretty much every named character being complicated in some way, shape, or form. Michiko is loud, often jumps to violence, and rude, but that's not all there is to her. Even within the second episode where we get to see more of her, we come to understand that she's a hopeless romantic, that she does care about the people close to her, and her apparent immaturity stems from her naive beliefs. Then, while they're fairly few and far between throughout the show, there are a small number of queer or queer-coded characters that are all really well written. Michiko has a friend from the gang she used to be a part of who is all types of gay camp, and it's really nice to see a gay character in an anime who isn't the butt of a joke. Later, we meet a man who's a Chinese opera singer that also does drag.
Drag is unquestionably an art form for queer people, even if the man in question is stated to be straight. Yeah, honey, I'm sure she is. Beyond that, Sayo Yamamoto demonstrates an absolute masterclass of queer coding, and those who have seen Yuri on Ice probably know exactly what I'm talking about here. Atsuko, the closest person that this show has to an antagonist, is implied to have had feelings for Michiko, beyond a standard friendship.
I'm not the only person to have noted this, though the fact that only a few people seem to have seen it bothers me a little. Though not as much as another potential queer-coded character that I haven't seen anyone else bring up, even if I feel it probably wasn't intentional.
However, I'll touch on that more later. But the level of care and respect that went into the creation of characters like these is truly extraordinary, when media to this day seems to have trouble with well-written representation, and I believe it's another very strong factor of the love that Yamamoto brought into the creation of this show. Another very major theme that's explored through Michiko and Hatchin is faith, and it ties very neatly into the exploration of love.
The most direct portrayal of faith in the show is faith in God, which is seen as early as the first episode in Hatchin's adoptive parents. Their faith is only a big ploy though, as they rely on material things that will get them money and disregard their adopted daughter.
This doesn't stop Father Pedro from acting like he saved Hatchin from something worse, though. But the theme of faith is played a lot more subtly throughout the show, extending to Michiko and Atsuko's desires.
Michiko has the utmost faith in Hiroshi is faithful, loving, and that he would never run off with another woman. We see this naivety rear its head as early as episode 3, where Michiko gets her fortune told by a rather unscrupulous old woman, and even gets the extra things that the fortune teller offers her. Michiko believes the reading wholeheartedly, getting a sketch of Hiroshi within the same day and asking around to see if anyone has seen him. It's reckless faith, a belief that there's true love waiting out there for her that would never abandon her. It's a fantasy she's created for herself, one that ends up not being real whatsoever. This is similarly reflected for Atsuko in episode 13, where she tries to help a young, hot-headed girl find a golden pot that's supposedly buried in the depths of an ancient pyramid. It ends up being just out of reach, and trying to get to it would actually kill Atsuko, even if it's very slow. It's toxic. With that said, it could be interpreted that Sayo Yamamoto thinks that faith is not good to have, and that it won't lead to the type of love that people are looking for.
But I actually believe the opposite is true, because of Hatchin.
In episode 3, Hatchin gets her fortune told as well. Where Michiko's fortune was a very direct and clear reading of what Michiko wanted to hear, Hatchin's reading is a lot more vague, ending in Hatchin getting in a situation that would end up in her death. Hatchin is far more emotionally mature than Michiko is, partially due to her upbringing forcing her that way, and she immediately gets the impression that the fortune teller is full of it. However, as the episode progresses, Hatchin's fortune ends up coming true in its entirety, even down to the cheap plastic rocks that would supposedly save her. This demonstrates that Hatchin needs to have more faith in things, which I believe is emphasized by the faith she puts in Michiko near the end of episode 2, which remains shaky for a large portion of the show. However, it's shown for Hatchin as well that blind faith isn't a good thing, as seen in episode 12, where she takes Michiko to an unscrupulous doctor that claims to have the power of God. I believe that the message that Yamamoto is trying to convey is that faith can be very good. If we didn't have faith in anything, even the faith in our own abilities, we'd be broken as individuals. However, putting faith blindly in anything is just as bad as having no faith whatsoever, as bad actors can manipulate that faith to try to control people, as seen with the aforementioned doctor and Hatchin's adoptive family.
And this ties back to the love that both our protagonists are seeking, where Michiko and Hatchin's respective relationships to faith are reflected nearly perfectly with the love that they're seeking out. I've already brought up that Michiko has made something of a fantasy for herself and how she believes that Hiroshi is patiently waiting for her, but Hatchin is nearly the exact opposite at the start of the series.
She briefly entertains the idea that someone who truly loves her would come to get her, but she dismisses it as the fantasy that it is before returning to her abusive adoptive family. Through the journey that Michiko and Hatchin take together, they discover that the love they were looking for was right next to them the entire time, but it's not as if they just needed to hug it out and find a place to live together from the beginning.
The journey across the country was absolutely necessary. In the interview that I brought up earlier, Yamamoto says that she loves to travel, and that is more than evident in even a surface level reading of any of her works. I mentioned near the beginning that the anime really likes to take its time to breathe, letting the viewers take in the world and everything going on in it, but this anime really does fully embrace every inch of the road trip genre, even adding some things that I feel end up working beautifully.
Much like how road trip movies have relationships between characters develop over the course of the journey, with each stop being a key part of the arc, Michiko and Hatchin learn to trust each other and develop a unique sort of love for each other over the course of the story.
But in this show, it goes further than just the relationship growing along with the journey progressing.
Even in my favorite road trip movie, each of the places that are visited are relatively nice. The worst place that's gone to is this rundown theme park, which serves to reflect the old values of one of the main characters. No place that's traveled to really reflects the struggle or internal chaos of the character's relationship, which is more so in the drive towards the climax. But as early as episode 3 of Michiko and Hatchin shows a much darker part of the world we're in, and gunfights and violence are an absolute necessity for Michiko from the outside of the series. These characters aren't just in a struggle with each other, they're in a struggle with the environment that they're in.
It's a narrative device that only works in the medium that it's in, as most road trip movies don't have the time to also have an externally chaotic world which parallels the internal chaos of the main characters' developing relationship with each other. This amplifies the message that Yamato is telling, in my opinion. Love isn't just good vibes and a strong positive feeling towards something, it's a mess. Love is hard, it's mean, and yes, it might even be violent. Sometimes the love we're looking for may not be what we actually need. Sometimes our own toxicity prevents us from having the relationship that we might otherwise want. It's complicated, and I adore the way that Michiko and Hatchin doesn't try to shy away from that complexity. Even the love that ends up being genuine between Michiko and Hatchin, something unique between a mother-daughter relationship and a strong friendship, is incredibly unrocky, and both their personalities end up clashing against each other all the way to the end of the show. The violent environment that surrounds the characters reaches its peak in episode 8, which is similarly where tensions between Michiko and Hatchin reach their breaking point. It's in this episode where Hatchin leaves Michiko, citing all they do is yell at each other, and Hatchin ends up finding a circus where the environment is a lot more peaceful, or at least relative to whatever the fuck was happening earlier. It's at this circus where Hatchin even meets a different Michiko, one who's a lot more pleasant, outwardly caring, and genuinely happy in comparison to the Michiko that Hatchin has come to know.
However, this peace and the love that's shown to Hatchin turns out to just be a facade, a ploy to sell the children that were in the circus, and the care was just to get them to fetch a higher price, with this Michiko being kinder to Hatchin because of the fact she's white. I believe that what Yamamoto is trying to say here is that real love isn't just surface deep, and it will come with a lot of struggles. As the old saying goes, if something seems too good to be true, that means it probably is. The final episode of this mini arc also really goes to show just how far Michiko is willing to go for the people she cares about. And I find it significant that from this point onward, Michiko is at least a little bit more caring towards Hatchin. But now I want to turn away from the canonical relationships in the show to focus more on things that were left unconfirmed. That's right, it's time to dive into some queer-coded characters. LGBTQ+ characters are rather few and far between in most anime and manga, and the most you might see is a rather small character kissing someone of the same gender briefly, if even that. A lot of queer characters are left to just be vague, and I imagine that's because queer people are still not quite socially accepted yet, especially trans people and trans women in particular. I am non-binary myself, and seeing characters that are even remotely like me is always refreshing, especially if it's done right. It is nice that the best-selling manga as of today has a considerable score of explicitly queer characters, even if an overwhelming percentage of their designs leave a lot to be desired, but I digress. As mentioned briefly earlier, there is an explicit gay character in Michiko and Hatchin who not only shows up early on, but he also has a really good design and is generally well written. Even though he only shows up for a grand total of 2 episodes, it really does feel like this is a gay character, with nothing feeling forced about his queerness whatsoever. And while he is stated to be straight, the Chinese opera singer is unquestionably doing drag, which indicates that he is at least culturally queer. And of all the jokes that surround him, none of them feel like they're putting him down for doing something that would be considered not manly. However, I would be remiss to not mention this rather tasteless action from his son, but I think this is done so that Hatchin reversing gender roles near the end of the episode is really driven home. Other than those two, there is the woman in episode 16 who kisses Michiko on the mouth and lips, but I'm actually hesitant to call her queer. We know that she has had actual sex with Hiroshi and that she grows big boy tomatoes, but it isn't really clear if she kisses Michiko out of a sense of attraction or to drive a point that Hiroshi is a cheater. But with such explicitly queer characters, it is a bit of a mystery why there would be any queer coding whatsoever, but I believe this is largely due to the fact that the queer characters are so minor in the grand scheme of the story. A character like Atsuko, who is so present, especially through the latter half of the show, is more than likely kept vague because this show aired in 2008, and even gay relationships weren't yet recognized in the US, let alone Japan. That being said, Atsuko is so clearly gay that it's kind of baffling that so few of the reviews I've seen have picked up on it. Although I do believe you should still check them all out, as they're quite good regardless. Atsuko reads so hard as a bitter ex-girlfriend that is desperately trying to get Michiko back in her life, to the point that Atsuko is even willing to hurt Michiko. It's clear that Atsuko has mixed feelings at the very least,
but there's an undeniable love there, which is why she continually helps Michiko, even when it would hurt her standing in the police force. And then there's also episode 13, which just clearly tells me that Atsuko is batting for the home team, if you catch my drift. But now, I'd like to briefly discuss potential queer themes with Satoshi.
I'm making this analysis with people who've already seen this show in mind, but if you've decided to watch this without seeing the anime anyways, or it's been a while since you watched this show, I'll give context.
Satoshi Batista is the leader of the gang Monstro, which is implied to be pretty large and widespread across the entire country. Michiko goes to find him pretty early on with the belief that he'll know where Hiroshi is, since Hiroshi became Satoshi's best friend at a very young age, along with helping create Monstro.
Satoshi and the gang culture are things that I wish I could focus on more, but I don't feel like I'm at all qualified to give my opinion on them, much less analyze them.
Anyways, Satoshi is a character that takes things very personally, and has an attachment to things that happened in his youth. When he remembers or talks about Hiroshi, it's always about how much Satoshi trusted him, how Hiroshi would bail him out of a tough spot, things like that. We even see that he talks about Hiroshi in the exact same way that Michiko does. To me, this reads as a strong friendship that could have evolved into something more, and it seems that it did for Satoshi at least. Another strong indication is the fact that the explicit queer character from episodes 5 and 6 used to be a part of Satoshi's gang. This one has less support than even Atsuko's relationship with Michiko, so I think it makes sense that nobody else saw it.
However, there is one final queer reading that I'm surprised to be the first to even see, even if I do believe it wasn't at all intentional. Before I get into the meat of this section, I feel it necessary to restate and stress that I do not think that Hatchin is meant to be a trans allegory, at least not intentionally.
I start out like this knowing perfectly well that the worst people imaginable will probably still try to argue with me on this, but I want to make it clear regardless so that no one can say I'm interacting with this text in a bad faith way. That being said, even if something was not at all intended by the author doesn't mean seeing it is an incorrect reading.
Just because the author wanted to pick blue curtains because it was a color on their mind, doesn't mean that the curtains don't also represent a depression or loneliness. We shouldn't have to rely on the author to explain their art for us, which is why media analysis fucking exists.
There are a lot smarter people out there who have done better dissertations on this than I could ever hope to, and if I find a good video on this again, it'll also be linked in the description. Now with all that out of the way, I'm going to be proceeding in this section as if the trans themes of Hatchin's story are intentional, just so I can hopefully help other people who have seen this anime understand where I'm coming from.
I need to do more research in this regard, but gender in Japan seems to be viewed much differently than it is in the West.
It's also not at all uncommon for manga and anime to play around with gender roles and expectations, to cite Princess Knight and Revolutionary Girl Utena as clear examples. Yamamoto herself definitely seems to like going against traditional gender roles as well. Yuri on Ice has one very clear example that I can think of off the top of my head, and Michiko and Hatchin also dips its toes into this territory, pretty explicitly. More than once, Hatchin is mistaken for a boy, and one character who does clock her gender calls her a tomboy.
On its own, this normally wouldn't be enough for me to see a trans story in any character, but Hatchin's story follows a number of beats that are so similar to the trans experience that I'm surprised to be the first person pointing them out.
To begin with, Hatchin's story opens up with her being raised by a very abusive foster family, which is also religious. I will make a quick aside here to say that, even if the trans themes were intentional, I do not believe that this is enough to say anything concretely.
Stories where people are abused by adoptive families are very common, like Cinderella, Matilda, and perhaps most damning for any sort of queer allegory, Harry fucking Potter.
It is unique here that the family in question is specifically that of a priest, and otherwise largely religious, but I still don't think it has heavy implications for Hatchin's gender, more applying to the theme of faith as I mentioned earlier. Also, as mentioned earlier, Father Petro even says that he saved Hatchin, meaning that he believed he was always doing the right thing. But more significant to me in the beginning of the show is how Hatchin says that she does not want to be called Hana by Michiko, specifically saying that she hates the name. This is where Michiko starts calling her Hatchin, though I would be remiss if I said Hatchin immediately adopts this name and uses it for the rest of her life. In encounters with other characters, she only once specifically asked to be called Hatchin, letting most people call her Hana.
So Hana isn't quite analogous to a dead name for her, and it isn't like Hatchin is a particularly masculine name. Michiko herself says that she thinks it's cute.
However, I do think that is absolutely unbelievable coincidence, for there is no way that it's intentional, that Hatchin is quite similar to the English word hatching, and a common trans metaphor is that transitioning feels like hatching, as in from an egg. Maybe the eggs Hatchin used for her omelets weren't the only eggs that cracked in the show. In episode 3, Hatchin starts to try and take control of her life, and cuts her hair as part of this determination.
This is a pretty common metaphor within media in general, but it's very significant to me that Hatchin never lets her hair grow out ever again, even in a scene I'll touch on later in this segment, though you may know what I'm talking about considering the emphasis I've put on seeing this series before watching the video.
More than this, Hatchin routinely dresses in outfits that are more masculine, though as a non-binary person I am legally obligated to say that clothing does not have gender and you can wear whatever you want forever. But presentation is a large part of gender, and Hatchin presents so well as male that a character who mistakes her as a boy even tries to kiss her. I'll focus on this more in just a bit, but the point I want to make here is that Hatchin seems to be purposely making herself look more male, even perhaps subconsciously. Throughout the series, there are several characters that we meet whose lives, stories, and or relationships are meant to be reflective of Michiko and Hatchin, either one or both of them. This is perhaps most obvious in episode 4, where the two meet Pepe, who's trying to get a better life for her younger sister Lulu. This relationship is another that emphasizes the theme of love in the story, but I feel that was well covered in a different review. More interesting to me in particular are the 3 characters that are supposed to reflect or be analogous to Hatchin that she interacts with. It's through each of these lenses that I want to paint the picture that I can so clearly see in my mind. First, when Hatchin leaves Michiko in episode 8, she runs into another girl named Rita in episode 9. This girl is one of the aforementioned characters who mistakes Hatchin for a boy, going so far to say that she's her boyfriend when she just met. And she likely meant this in a romantic context too, considering that she tries to kiss Hatchin not moments later when running from another boy.
Hatchin does not deny being male up until the kiss, and I can't help but imagine that's because of her abusive religious upbringing that made her believe that girls shouldn't kiss other girls.
But more than Rita's mistake or what she does in that blind belief is what she represents. Rita serves as yet another reinforcement of the theme of faith, believing that a statue which cries blood will grant her a wish, very similar to Michiko's faith. Hatchin helping her out here is interesting to me because she was so disillusioned from Michiko's goals since the very beginning, so I think that Hatchin sees a bit of herself in Rita, wishing for something that seems to be impossible. The second kid that Hatchin meets is Lenine, a young boy who is also immediately interested in her, comparing her to an angel.
This episode is perhaps the one where Hatchin is the most feminine in terms of style.
Not only does she let Lenine call her Hana, but she also dresses more like a girl throughout the episode. However, it seems like Lenine loves her regardless, calling her Hatchin by accident and always being happy to see her. Feeling mixed about this acceptance, Hatchin is curious about him but still runs from him.
This tells me that she feels wrong for how she expresses herself, even when she's dressed the way that society expects of her.
Hatchin is probably also scared that if she were to truly express herself, Lenine wouldn't like it, no matter how untrue that is. And, while this has nothing to do with the trans allegory, I did want to bring up the ending of this episode briefly. Other reviews I've seen have mentioned that this breakdown from Hatchin at the end is related to the fact that she has to leave somebody that she likes, or even considering this period cramps, which actually has a little more evidence throughout the episode. While I'm making this allegory for Hatchin being trans, I would be remiss if I didn't say it was equally possible that she was acting this way due to mood swings, another very common side effect of puberty in general. But this breakdown feels more than that to me. Just before this, Hatchin has one last talk with Lenine, who has forgotten everything except for the name Hatchin had told him, and after speaking it, he disappears.
This, to me, reads as a death, and Hatchin breaking down here feels more significant than just period cramps, which I feel is reinforced by what she says here.
But I understand that it's unclear, since every other death within this series is depicted explicitly and never left up to interpretation like this. Last but certainly not least of the children who reflect Hatchin, there's the Chinese opera singer's son. I'll take this opportunity to break from intense, deep text analysis that was probably never intended, since this episode bears it out in nearly plain text. Hatchin is meant to not be performing the gender role expected of her, and the gender roles are completely flipped in the latter half of this episode. Although, if they are both trans, this would be normal gender roles? Along with the other queer coding, this signifies to me that Yamamoto or one of the other writers were at least playing around with Hatchin's gender expression on purpose, and also deeply aware of the implications they were putting out. I also want to briefly touch on Hatchin's relationship with Michiko here, as I believe it's significant for a trans reading. When Michiko first breaks into the religious family's home, Hatchin immediately notices that her mouth is partly open, not feminine whatsoever. Then, near the end of the show, Hatchin sees it again, without pointing it out for the audience.
In the beginning, Hatchin's perception of woman is more than likely shaped by what her abusive foster family taught her.
And Michiko is a bizarre outlier who looks and dresses very feminine, but acts very masculine. This probably has more to do with how Sao Yamamoto wanted to depict female rawness,
and complemented by the aforementioned reversal of gender roles in episode 16,
show that women can be just as strong and capable as men. But this defiance of gender norms, this strange contradiction, is precisely what Hatchin loves about Michiko, and Hatchin finds herself acting just like her in the final episode. Michiko, while a real person with her own story and desires, is also a metaphor for the freedom that Hatchin deeply wants. Freedom to be whatever she wants to be, wherever she wants to be. And it's for this reason that Michiko's bike is an important piece of symbolism, because it is quite literally the vehicle for them to reach that freedom. It's also incredibly significant to me that the police are essentially the antagonist of the story, not just in an ACAB way, but also in how it reinforces Michiko and her bike as analogous to freedom. And this is further complemented by the end of Michiko and Hatchin. While I have already given a warning for those who haven't seen it, I will emphasize that this show's ending is so incredibly important to me, and I really want people to experience it for themselves to really understand why I love it so much. If you want to skip past this part, here's the time step for that. At the end of the show, we get a brief scene that is years after the events of this story, where Hatchin is grown up with a child of her own. She is very clearly still a girl, though this gag is funny for my interpretation. Her hair is still cut short, but she lets people call her Hana, and she's generally pretty happy where she is. She misses Michiko a lot, and when she reminisces on her brief reunion with Hiroshi, she says quite possibly the most trans thing ever. Her reunion with Michiko here has such a strong impact, bringing a full circle to Hatchin's original wish from the very first episode of the series. Knowing that Michiko is representative of freedom for Hatchin here means that Hatchin really misses the kind of freedom she had on the road, and the freedom she had to truly express herself. And this time, she gets to go on the journey knowing that she'll be with someone who truly loves her, no matter what. One final small thing for this reading that feels like just a casual bit of flavorful theming are the omelet. In the show's introduction to Hatchin, she is making an omelet for her family and a bit of the shell ends up on it. This small thing is repeated again when Michiko finally has a flashback to her life with Hiroshi, and again in the final episode. While this doesn't happen with her, I find it interesting that Michiko also makes an omelet as the last meal she'll ever share with Hatchin. Omelets are eggs that require the yolk to break in order to make them, and they'd likely be the kind of eggs you'd have if you made a mistake when cracking the egg to begin with. Omelets themselves are a product of accident, still tasting just as good regardless. The love that's shared between our two titular characters evolves to be that which way they love each other, in spite of and because of the flaws that they both have. But more than this, the fact that this symbolism is shown with eggs just makes the trans allegory all the stronger to me, even if there is no fucking way this was intentional. Speaking of flaws though, I think it might finally be time for me to talk about those, since this analysis has been largely full of praise. A particular episode that I've seen more than a few reviewers point out as flawed is episode 14, where two assassins both try to kill Michiko under orders of Satoshi Batista. It's highlighted for the fact that, despite the stakes and the characters ostensibly being hired assassins, neither of their plotlines really get resolved and they never appear in the story ever again. This is more so a microcosm of a larger problem that the same reviewers have said, where a lot of the characters never show up past whatever episode they were introduced in, and the assassins are particularly representative of that. This actually didn't bother me as much, as it is a necessary, albeit unfortunate, side effect of the road trip genre. Again, my favorite movie in this genre keeps its cast of characters rather small so that there aren't any thematically important characters left stranded at a certain point of the journey. I do understand the frustration though, particularly with the assassins, since they were fucking hired by Satoshi Batista, who is a character that consistently reappears. But I actually dislike episode 14 in a differenter and specialer way than everyone else does. The very moment we meet Satoshi Batista, he's very quickly established as someone who takes things incredibly personally and remembers things that happened years ago. In the episode that we first meet him, he is holding somebody hostage in exactly the same way that they were holding him as a kid. So we see that if something or someone truly pisses him off, he deals with them in a very direct and personal way, and he does not let things go. And then when he's dealing with someone who he has never had relationships with, he has a very unique and horrifying method of torture for them. So with that said, what is this man fucking doing? Hiring assassins to get rid of people who did him wrong? This is absolutely uncharacteristic of him, especially with how he eventually ends up actually taking care of Shinsuke. And these assassins' lack of relevance and lack of any significant relation to Satoshi hurts this episode all the more. Episode 14 really just ends up feeling unnecessary, since both of the assassins end up failing, and Satoshi runs over Shinsuke himself. It bugs me all the more because the point of the fake Satoshi in episode 8 is that Satoshi isn't the kind of person to use empty threats and throw around his name to get what he wants. He is the threat, and he'll make sure that people know that. I'm genuinely unsure of what the writers were doing with this episode. Another thing is less of a flaw and more of a personal wish that also involves Satoshi. While I'm sure it's not the case, A surface level reading of Michiko and Hatchin could lead someone to believe that the message is man bad.
Hiroshi is a womanizer and a cheater who runs away from Michiko throughout the story. Satoshi and a lot of the other minor male characters throughout the series are extremely misogynistic, directing their anger at Michiko seemingly for just existing as a woman.
And I'll say now that this doesn't bother me that much on its own.
As I've transitioned and learned more about how women are treated in the world, I can see how a woman might see the world this way, male-dominated as it is.
This is a story for the girls, and there's nothing wrong with that.
But I can't help but wish Satoshi had a proper redemption. He kidnaps Hatchin near the end of the show, but we see that he has a similar unique care for her as Michiko does, and Hatchin sees just how similar Satoshi is to Michiko. I think that having Satoshi raise Hatchin while Michiko serves her time in prison would have been interesting.
Satoshi's story is otherwise a tragedy. This man started at the top of the most powerful gang in the country, but slowly lost it all at the hands of a greedy subordinate and a rival gang.
There's an unspoken sadness to the fact that Satoshi kills Shinsuke, that despite the fact that they were against each other, Satoshi still had some care for him.
Having Satoshi raise Hatchin would cement the fact that he learned to care, and would be a really sweet end to his story.
But I know that life doesn't always work out the way you want it to, and Satoshi's last moments are protecting Hatchin anyways, so this is less of an actual problem and more so just a personal wish.
Other than that, I don't have any major complaints with the show, other than maybe how hypersexualized Michiko often is, though it's clear that she wants to dress that way, and it's vanishingly rare that any character is horny for her. This is something that I feel is also eclipsed by how interesting and complicated Michiko is as a character, so this is barely even a flaw at all. Ever since my first watch of this series, my love has only steadily grown for it, much like how Michiko and Hatchin steadily grow to love each other. If that isn't a masterpiece, I don't fucking know what is. Whenever I consume any piece of media nowadays, I'm always looking for any amount of love put into the making of it.
My relationship with love has dramatically changed ever since I started making art myself, and I like to see how different creators put different expressions of love into their art.
There's usually always something to find, and it's part of the reason that my personal rating system, which I'll never use for these types of analysis videos, is so heavily weighted positively. Michiko and Hatchin is so full of love, not only in its story and theming, but also in what the writers, character designer, music composer, animators, and every single person working on this project put into it. To say I appreciate this anime would be an understatement, especially with the analysis that you hopefully just watched. Sayo Yamamoto and the writers working with her have such a good grasp on love in its entirety, and Michiko and Hatchin is a testament to that. To close off this video, I'd like to again suggest the other reviews of this show which I've linked in the description, because there's good aspects to each of them, and there are things I wouldn't be talking about myself if these other reviewers hadn't already said things about them.
The world is big, so much bigger than you could possibly imagine, and there's love to be found in each and every corner of it. Go on your own journey and find the love that resonates the most with you. This has been Duple, your local mischievous kitsune, and I hope I've shown you a bit of chaotic beauty today. Peace.